Somewhere in the vaults of a secret bank deep in a Swiss canton are the skeptical stewards of international capital, the Gnomes of Zurich.
Hello and welcome to the second edition of the Gnomes of Zurich, an irreverent look at financial markets which we hope you find relevant. This week we are going to talk about inflation, central banks and their implications for investors. And who better to discuss these issues with than the esteemed Macrostrategy economist James Ferguson. So James, we've now had one soft inflation number in a row at just 7.7% year on year. So the bull market in everything can resume. Come back, Cathy Duddy Wood. Inflation was transitory after all. 7.7% down from 9% in June, going to 2%. What can possibly go wrong?
Well, I think the main things that can go wrong, well, the first thing that would spring to mind is time. So if you look at the inflation peaking in June, then that peak occurred after 18 months of breakout inflation. And at every step of that, the bond market was telling us that inflation will be back at the 2% target within 12 months. So obviously, that was really resoundingly wrong. And if you extrapolate the rate at which headline CPI is coming off, I mean, no one really knows how fast CPI will come down. So let's just draw a straight line extrapolation from the June peak through the most recent figure of October, all the way down. That'll take us back to 2% around about summer of 2024. So by that stage, we will have had something in the order of 3 or more years of inflation being well above target, even though the bond market kept telling us that inflation will be back at 2% within 12 months. So the biggest problems we have are A, inflation isn't going to, even if it's heading back to 2%, it's probably not going to get there within the timeframes that a market that wants to buy today is comfortable with. The second problem is that the bond market's indications to us as to what inflation will do are quite clearly very inaccurate. And we know why they're inaccurate because some very good work by the Peterson Institute, or at least Joseph Gagnon and Marty Sarsenbayev at the Peterson Institute, found out that if you run some regression analyses, what you discover is absolutely no relationship between government bond yields. It's not just for the US, it's for all the developed world, and forward inflation, but it's very closely related to historical inflation. So put that into a sort of into plain English, the bond market agrees with the quantum physicist Niels Bohr that prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. So it doesn't try. What it does is it says, tell me what, if I'm buying a 10-year bond, tell me what the average CPI was over the last 10 years, and I want that return plus an inflation buffer, some sort of protection. Now that average historically before the great financial crisis was about 3%. So right now we've got a roundabout a 2.5% 10-year CPI average. So you add 3% to that, and that suggests bond yield should be 5.5%. And by the way, mathematically speaking, at the rate that inflation is probably coming off, there's no way we're not going to raise the 10-year CPI average over the next 18 to 24 months above 3%. So as a very basic starting point, we should say to ourselves, if inflation 10-year average historical is going up to 3%, we can forget the near-term volatility and the peaks up at 9% or even the 7.7% now. We only have to worry about 3%. That's the good news. Bad news is we then have to add some protection. And historically, that's 3%. So that suggests we should be looking at approximately a 10-year bond yield of 6%. Now, that's a big problem when we've actually got a big figure of 3%. So where is the bond market going wrong? And where is where the bond market is going wrong is that they're basically assuming that as soon as CPI starts heading back, we can immediately play and jump straight to playing it being back at 2%. It may not even make 2%. There's a lot of inbuilt lags in inflation, and I'm sure you probably don't want me to go into too much detail about them right here. There's lots of inbuilt lags to inflation, as we discovered in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s. that mean it's incredibly hard once inflation's out of the box to get it back in that box. I'm just thinking one really obvious one. Wage negotiation. So let's say we have inflation bestowed upon us this year at 10%. I don't know, oil prices go up or whatever. So inflation is 10%. So everybody who's about to negotiate their annual wage round goes, well, all my costs are now 10% higher. So inflation, having gone up to 10%, is about to crash all the way back down within the next 12 months to back to target, except now all the workers who are already 10% out of pocket say, well, now I want my wages to go up 10%. So when the wage round comes up in the following year, year two, then we have another impulse to make inflation go back up again. And this problem with all these lags that are built into prices surging once they've surged is just one of the reasons why it's very hard to get inflation back in its box.
So if we think that the conventional way of measuring inflation, the CPI, is about a third, I think, service sector inflation, a third rents, and a third manufactured goods, it's that third, which is service sector inflation, which will be much harder to tame without unemployment getting very much higher than it currently is in the US.
Well, I don't think it's just, I mean, you're actually right, but I don't think it's just the service sector component. So let's say that the goods component largely behaves itself, except of course it will be prone to problems with wage increases. But even if that's the case, then we have these other 2/3 bits. You describe 1/3 as rent. It's actually, technically speaking, 1/3 is much more owner's equivalent rent, which is actually house prices. And the extent to which house prices have gone up, they may be coming off again now because of the surge in mortgage rates, but the enormous gap they've already opened up with the CPI means that even if we had a crash in house prices in the US, the equivalent of the unprecedented crash in house prices that occurred at the time of the great financial crisis and the subprime bubble bursting, we would still have room for another 6 to 7% annual inflation in owner's equivalent rent for at least the next 2 years. So it's incredibly unlikely that owner's equivalent rent is going to behave in the way that the end of inflationists want it to do. And then, as you said, the other third is services. And what is a service? If someone provides you a service, you're paying them, so it's wages, basically. So, and the wages problem is the one I just described. So basically, you've got lagging impulses from wages and from owner's equivalent rent, which are liable to keep inflation sticky on the high side, even if goods do behave and come all the way back down to the 2% target.
So if by magic CPI gets back to 2% at some point next year, what would have happened in the economy that you're not currently forecasting?
Well, it would be relatively easy, in inverted commas, to make CPI crash back to 2% in 2023. But the way of doing it, the only way that we've really worked out in the past of doing it is to destroy demand, which otherwise known as a recession. So if the Fed was to impose a deep enough and harsh enough and sustained enough recession, and that was to kick in early enough, because again, we got this problem with time. They're already trying to cause a recession. They've been hiking rates for many months, and they keep telling everyone they're going to hike them even further, and they've been hiking at a very fast rate. They are starting way behind the curve, but as you can see, it's not that easy to slow the economy down. And one of the reasons it's not that easy to slow the economy down is that banks keep increasing lending. Households still have huge amounts of excess deposits built up because of the ridiculous COVID policies that caused the inflation in the first place. And you have to leach all these pressures out of the economy before you can make your current policy mix actually do the job you want. Now, they do have one very, very good bit of news for them if they're trying to cause recession. And if you want to get rid of inflation and that's your sole job, then you unfortunately are trying to cause recession. I mean, unless you destroy demand, there's no way you're going to slow inflation down. So when they tell us that they're trying to achieve a soft landing, that's being very disingenuous. I mean, you know, you either have recession or you have the inflation. You don't really choose to have kind of a little bit of one and none of the other type thing.
I think there's since 1948, and there's been no there's been no period where inflation has gone over 5% in the US where it hasn't gone back under 5% without a hard landing and a quite a deep recession.
Yes, I mean, it doesn't surprise me. But, you know, the secret of like the old joke, the old Irish joke about how would you find your way to Cork, you know, don't start from here, goes, I mean, the secret about inflation is don't start it. Once you've started it, all your nightmares begin. And the arrogance with which they printed money during COVID for the stupidest of reasons, and to facilitate, you know, what was a very dangerously stupid fiscal idea. They'd all been reading, quite frankly, the very academically sparse tracts that constituted MMT. And despite the fact that they claimed that they weren't being influenced by it, they clearly were, and they did exactly what MMT proponents said they should do. And exactly what everyone else said would happen as a consequence did, inflation.
I know your economists are quite divided about whether QE actually causes real economy inflation. There are some economists that say because QE sits on bank balance sheets as reserves, it doesn't leave the financial asset economy, and only bank lending and government fiscal stimulus can therefore cause real economy inflation. Where do you sit on that? I mean, presumably at some point higher asset prices do lead to higher inflation because people can borrow against higher assets, and also they'll spend more if they feel wealthier.
Yes, I mean, it's actually even more simple than that. The counterpoint to the increased reserves on the Fed's balance sheet, these reserves are the Fed's liabilities. So they're the bank's assets. So it's like the banks deposit their money at the Fed. And these deposits at the Fed are the bank's assets. The reason they've done this is because what the Fed's done is it's gone out and bought securities off non-banks. When I say QE, most people think of QE as being an expansion of the central bank's balance sheet, but in actual fact, an awful lot of that it can be nonsense. In fact, all of it can be nonsense if you're in Japan, if the central bank only buys assets off banks. QE only really works, and is only really understood to work by proponents who understand what they're doing, like Mervyn King, for example, at the Bank of England, happens when the purchases of assets are purchased off non-banks. So if you purchase assets of a non-bank, and let's say you're the Fed, that you then deposit the money, which you've just bought these assets with, you deposit that money in the deposits of the non-bank. This is why it's so important for a non-bank. Now, the non-bank's deposits are banks' liabilities. So the banks all say to the Fed, hold on a second, you just increased my liabilities. What are you trying to do, bankrupt me? And the Fed says, don't worry about it. I've just credited you with reserve assets on your account with me here at the Fed. So you only get QE when the counterparties are non-bank, and you only get an expansion of the money supply, i.e. bank deposits or bank deposit liabilities, if the counterparties are non-bank. So when people talk about QE, they often just mean any securities purchases that the central bank makes, but it's actually the counterparty that's really important. So when I say QE, I mean only those purchases which are off non-banks. Now, when you do that, you've increased money supply. That's what an increase in bank deposits is. And when you increase money supply, what we find over time, this is it's officially called velocity. It's a terribly bad name. We find over time that there's a fairly stable relationship between the amount of money holdings that people in the real economy demands and the level of nominal GDP. It's not too different to about 1 times annual GDP. So you say, if I then increase my money deposits by 40%, which is what they did after COVID, then you have this mismatch. You have 40% more money than we need. Now, what do people who don't need 40% more money do with it? Well, they try and get rid of it. They go, I don't need that much cash. I better start investing some of it, or I better start spending the rest of it. And when people try to invest and spend away money, of course, they're already passing it on to other people who then pass it around. So the only way you can close this gap that you've opened up is for nominal GDP to come up and meet the level of money supply, call it bank deposits. And so that's what we've been witnessing. We've been witnessing nominal GDP, not real GDP. So don't forget, we're having very little real economic growth, but we are having double-digit nominal GDP growth, but we tend to split that into real economic growth and inflation. And that's what the inflation is. And until the two meet again, we will continue to have inflationary pressure, even though money supply has actually been falling in the US now since February. Because of this bulge of excess deposits, that's not actually having the normal negative dampening effect until this bulge has been worked through.
So if we think that the central banks did quantitative easing for over a decade before we had this big inflation problem post-COVID, was it just the quantum of QE that caused the inflation problem, or was there something different about the QE that caused a much bigger problem?
The quantum of QE in terms of central bank asset purchases was about the same, which is why they made the quite frankly schoolboy error of thinking that it would have the same effect, which is not.
But it was the same, but in a small period of time, right?
Well, it was in a smaller period of time, but much more importantly, the reason why the original QE was done was because bank deposits were being destroyed. Yeah. If you create new money as a commercial bank by making a new loan and crediting someone's bank account with the money you just lent to them, and you do a double entry bookkeeping thing, we say new asset loan, new liability deposit. When you have loans which are going into non-performing, or actually you have borrowers saying I can't pay you back, then that process goes into reverse and you wipe out money. So the banks ended up with, after all recoveries, nearly $1 trillion of loans that they'd extended to the private sector, where the private sector said, sorry, can't pay you back. You can have the collateral, but good luck selling that in this environment. And sure enough, therefore, the banks had to write down $1 trillion. They also had to increase their capital because the authorities said, we now discovered it was our mistake with the regulations. We let you get too heavily geared. It wasn't the bank's fault. They did what they were told. So the banks had to increase their capital by about 500 billion. So you got about 1.5 trillion of money being taken out of the system. Because don't forget, money is bank deposit liabilities. So banks' non-deposit liabilities have to come out of deposit liabilities, i.e. the bank recapitalizes itself and it says to me, it is a rights issue, I need you to subscribe to the rights issue, and I have to write a check, and that comes out of my bank account. So while they were doing QE the first time round, which amounted nominally to about 3.75 trillion, that only worked out at about 2.8 trillion where there was a non-bank counterparty. As I said, if it's bank to bank, it's just an asset swap, so nothing happens. So actual QE was only 2.8 trillion, and 1.5 trillion was basically required to replenish loans that had collapsed at the banks and replenish their capital. So you ended up with only something like about 1.3 trillion of net money supply increase, and that was spread out over 6 years. That worked out at around about a broad money supply increase of around about, give or take, 3% a year. That's not inflationary. How can nominal money supply growth at 3% a year end up being inflationary? So what they did this time was they did it all into the space of 2 years. There was no, there were no countervailing forces. So there was no increase in non-performing loans, no increase in foreclosures, no losses for the banks, and the banks didn't need to raise any more capital. Therefore, the entire gross impact of QE was coming through as net. So that's why we had the 40% increase in money supply.
Yeah, so I think that 30% or 40% increase in money supply is now back to like 1% or money supply growth that we last saw, I think, during the financial crisis. So why wouldn't that by itself slow inflation if inflation is just, as Milton Friedman suggested, a monetary phenomenon?
Well, it absolutely will. But first, we have to wait for that lump of money that was created when we were printing at a rate of 40% to feed through, because Milton Friedman also said that the impact of broadening money, or excess money supply, as he more accurately called it, acts with long and variable lags. So it takes time for the money you printed to get through into and circulate in the economy, raise nominal GDP, allowed to feed into the wage negotiations and lift inflation. So although if we'd started at equilibrium, and money supply growth was now down at 1% on a year-on-year basis. Actually, it's negative it's about 5% negative on an annualized 3 to 4 month basis. That would normally be incredibly deflationary, but we have to bear in mind the fact that we're still running through the money we already printed before. And so your crossover will probably happen around about next summer. So we'll probably find that the Fed's being far too tight. Nothing's happening, and then suddenly we'll use up that lump of excess money, and we'll suddenly find that the Fed is then way too tight, given the fact we're now suddenly sort of, having the full impact.
Yeah. So how would a monetarist explain inflation in Europe, which is at least twice as bad in the US, with presumably less monetary stimulus, but more exposed to the energy crisis?
Well, don't forget, two things about that. Firstly, Europe is busy printing money. So you've still got ongoing money supply growth in Europe, including UK in this, for I presume most people are British. So you've got the ongoing. The other thing is, why do you think we had the inflation in energy costs that we had? I mean, it was partly because they didn't bother to restock the storage tanks over the summer because they're, I don't know, idiots. But the other reason is that, of course, everybody had lots of money pumped into their bank accounts during the COVID lockdowns. So although we had a supply shock because most of them weren't going to work, we never had a demand shock because everybody was still paid as if they were still going to work. So one of the problems we've had, less so in Europe, but just as much as the US, is the fact that everybody had excess money. So when increased costs of say gas or whatever starts kicking in, people are, they whinge about it a lot, but they're able to pay it because they have more money. The problem with this imbalance that we have between Europe and the US, I think, is mainly the fact that the US has they printed much more money, so they've got much more embedded inflation, and they never had a sort of restocking LNG tanks / Putin problem boosting their energy. So their energy costs have never gone above kind of the long run average. So they haven't really had an inflationary or terms of trade shock, to be more accurate, with energy, and they have had more money as an overhang, which is why inflation in the US is proving, ridiculously difficult to suppress, even though they've got money supply going down. It will happen, but until it happens, they're all going to run around at the Fed like headless chickens, going, "Why the hell is are things not behaving, even though we're tightening policy?"
Yeah, and what's the rate of bank lending in the US at the moment, and fiscal stimulus? Is bank lending still?
Bank lending is very strong. I mean, don't forget, as far as banks are concerned, they haven't had any non-performing loans. They haven't had a problem with their capital, but they have had a massive increase in their reserves, courtesy of QE. What that effectively means is that they are very overcapitalized, more strongly capitalized probably than any time in their history. They keep changing the measure of capital, but if you try and equalize it, probably they've never been so well capitalized. They've certainly never had such a low proportion of assets as being risk assets. And now interest rates are going up. That's widening their net interest margins. So they're going, well, what on earth would I be doing if I wasn't expanding loan growth? So they are expanding loan growth. So this is what's neutralizing a large amount of, not all of, but a large amount of the QT that the Fed is doing, is that the commercial banks are going, well, you may be sort of retiring money, but we're fully incentivized to be growing it.
What about this?
I should just say that one of the very important implications of that is, though, that when the banks are growing money supply because they're making new loans, and the Fed is taking money out of the system because of QT, this causes a big disconnect between Main Street and Wall Street. What the commercial banks are doing is great for Main Street and keeps driving inflation, but of course the Fed is taking specifically the sorts of money that's used mainly on Wall Street and retiring that. So that's why you've got the fall of asset prices coinciding with ongoing inflation in the real economy.
And you've had this $2.5 trillion of assets parked back at the Fed by money market funds in the form of the reverse repo. I noticed that number had actually gone down to just 2 trillion, still a massive number, nearly 10% of GDP. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the answer to that question depends a little bit on what the Fed understands is going on. So if you're a money market fund, why would you put your money in the reverse repo, i.e. just depositing it at the Fed, like a sort of normal bank account which pays you interest, rather than buy a money market fund? Rather than buy a T-bill? Well, the difference is the interest that's paid. So until very recently, to a large extent, you got more interest at the reverse repo for shorter duration and for more guaranteed return. So there wasn't much reason to not put your money into the reverse repo. Starting to get a bit tighter. The money market funds are starting to find that the T-bills are offering increasingly, more competitive interest rates, and so they're starting not to be rushing all their money. They've also put nearly half of their assets, all their assets, into the reverse repo. So they're probably thinking, well, that's probably enough from a balance point of view. And now you've got Yellen talking about doing Treasury, talking about the Treasury buying back in some longer dated bonds. And of course, we know that the government has a huge requirement to borrow. We also know that the weighting of T-bills has gone back to its pre-COVID proportion, which is about 15% of total government debt. So all of which suggests that if they're going to be, during QT, also selling some of their long-dated bonds, this is going to put more and more emphasis on the short end. Now, they're doing this because the short end appears to be demonstrating an almost unlimited demand for debt. So why not do this? But the fact is that if they load too much supply onto the short end, that's going to push T-bill yields up even higher. And then the Fed has an issue, because let's say T-bill yields go significantly higher. Don't have to be much. I mean, it could be 10 basis points or something, but so let's say they go significantly higher than what the reverse repo is paying, which is the low end of the Fed funds rate. Then suddenly the money market funds don't have any reason to have any money in reverse repo. You could find that dramatic increase in funds flowing into reverse repo funneling out just as dramatically. And this,
but if that reverse repo number continues to shrink, that is to a degree offsetting QT.
Yeah, absolutely. This is all money that technically is taken out of money supply when it goes into reverse repo. Because you think about it from the Fed's point of view, so the Fed increases its reverse repo liabilities, deposit liabilities, and it has to do something to its asset, to its liability side to balance that. So if there's no change in assets and they're increasing their reverse repo liabilities, some other liabilities have to go down by an equal and offsetting amount, and that is reserves. So if you're taking the bank reserves down, then that's taking down the offsetting thing for bank deposits, which means that you're effectively lowering money supply. So if you pump the money back out of reverse repo into, well, think about what happens to the money market funds. They park the money in the Fed, it's outside of the economy. They take those funds and then start instead buying T-bills. They're buying T-bills off the Treasury, and the Treasury is using that money to buy things, pay wages, pay benefits, whatever, in the real economy. So that money goes straight back into the real economy. So you do get this potentially big reacceleration in money supply. Could happen then the Fed has to decide whether it's going to change its own rules and hike the amount of interest that it's paying to specifically get over what the T-bills are paying, or does the Fed not really notice what it's doing and therefore sits there passively going, oh, isn't that interesting? I mean, hard for us to know, since the only thing we know about the Fed is they don't seem to pay any attention to money supply. So we have to assume they're not watching these things.
But your base case argument is, although inflation will be higher for longer, that at some point this excess that has built up in the US economy will, given the monetary tightening that we've got, start to diminish, and therefore inflation will keep coming down until presumably the Federal Reserve then loosen monetary policy again. So they'll have to keep monetary policy a lot tighter for longer to stop the sort of structural inflationary forces coming back.
Well, I'd rather sort of play these things by ear, because there's too many things that could happen. But if you want me to go out a limb and say what I think is most likely to happen, what I think is most likely to happen is that the Fed will, it was already feeling very frustrated that the growth rate of inflation is not coming down as fast as they would like, but they may well be very heartened by some of the data that comes out in the next few months. mainly because they haven't really worked out that's still a long way from 2%. But anyway, they may well do that. But until they actually start to destroy demand through creating a proper real recession, we won't see what they're made of. But once they have started creating or destroying jobs and destroying demand, then we'll see whether they can take it and they can take the political pressure and stick with tightening, because maybe they just turn around and go, well, actually we have to ease off again. I wouldn't be at all surprised in 2 years' time if we don't have QE again. But I still think we ought to be paying attention to how much slower things in the real world go than things in financial markets. And this is a real world problem. And it looks to me like it's going to take, at the current rate, something like at least 18 months, but more, approaching 2 years for all the inflation to be leached out of the system. That is subject to whether the Fed accelerates the decline of money supply, and that's probably dependent on whether funds stay in the reverse repo or come out. There's an awful lot of slips twixt cuff and lip here. But at the rate that things seem to be going, I think inflation is going to be harder to put back in its box than they expect. But then we run quite a big risk that suddenly it is back in its box and they are inappropriately tight, and then they do a massive pivot. So I think they'll pivot very late, but very large, and possibly even to the extent of going back to QE. Though, whether they're aware or not, you could effectively do QE without having to have the embarrassment of announcing it by just lowering the interest rate you paid on RRP, reverse repo. If you lower the interest rate you pay on reverse repo, that makes it unattractive. The reverse repo funds can flow out of the Fed and back into T-bills and back into the economy. So you could do QE without ever having to embarrassingly say to everybody, we're doing QE.
Yeah. So at the last FOMC conference, Powell seemed to indicate that if the risks were not doing enough tightening, because at least if they did enough tightening to stop inflation and they tightened too much, they could always come back in. They had the tools to loosen, whereas the risks were very much that they didn't do enough and inflation stayed higher for longer. So since then, markets have continued to rebound and are now only down 10% year to date. So presumably that'll annoy Powell quite a lot.
Yeah, very possibly. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that I think a very substantial part of his job is to try and talk the market into doing what he wants. And it's much easier to threaten markets with higher rates and tighter policy than to enact higher rates and tighter policy. So if you can do it all with words, then obviously that would be attractive to him. But I think the markets at the moment are misconstruing the essential binary problem that they have, the paradox that they have. Either the Fed tightens hard enough to trigger recession, destroy demand, and destroy jobs, which is what's required to put inflation back in its box, or they don't. If we have a recession, then we're going to lose earnings from the equity market, and the equity market is not nearly cheap enough to sustain a significant hit to earnings and still look cheap. And if we basically don't put inflation back in its box, then bond yields would appear to be dramatically inappropriately too low. So the only thing you can really do is buy one. You can either buy equities if you think that if they're going to keep going with inflation, or you can buy bonds if you think they're going to impose a really harsh recession. It's very hard to justify buying both. And it's very hard to see how either of those performs unless you have quite an extreme outcome in one way or another.
So the stock market is engaging in a form of cakery, James, in that it wants its earnings cake and it wants its deflationary cake at the same time.
Yeah, I suspect so. Well, maybe the problem with the equity market is that there's no one there who was there in 1987.
Yeah.
I mean, we pretend we don't know what triggered the 87 crash, but it was pretty obvious to anyone who was there at the time that what had triggered the crash was that we had something like a 40% increase in bond yields. So though nothing had gone wrong in the equity market, we had to re-rate the equity or derate the equity market and impose a higher earnings yield on equities. The problem with having higher bond yields is that they really force up your earnings yield on equities And this was the lesson we learned from the inflationary 60s and 70s. You know, many sectors, banking being a really good example, many sectors saw inflation busting earnings growth. But their shares got annihilated. Why? Because they had to fall to much, much lower PEs, i.e. much, much higher earnings yields in order to compete with the required level that inflation at that time imposed. And so, you know, the lesson we learned from the inflationary period was that during inflation, there are no paper assets that perform. It's all real assets.
And like you, Argonaut's been a keen student of the history of the 70s, and there were a couple of false dawns in the 70s that inflation had been seen off. One in 1976 when Arthur Burns appeared on the front of, I think, Fortune magazine, and there was this this great adoration of Arthur Burns, which will come as a big shock to many people today that seem to portray him as this guy that didn't really understand inflation and kept rates too low in order to get Nixon re-elected. That in 1976, actually, people believed that Burns had seen off the inflationary problem, and then again with Volcker in 1980, in terms of the first time that Volcker raised rates to a very high level, the economy contracted, Volcker cut interest rates, and then he had to do exactly the same again 12 months later. What sort of parallels or lessons do you think the current Federal Reserve is drawing from those two years?
Well, one of the reasons why Jay Powell talks tough and likes to imply that he's Volcker reincarnated is the fact that he too delayed acting. So, you know, one of the reasons why the Fed's so far behind the curve is that he didn't want to prevent or diminish his chances of being re-elected for a second term. Lael Brainard was nipping at his heels, and she was a confirmed dove. I think there would be a good case for history to make that Jay Powell decided that you needed someone more hawkish at the Fed, but the irony was that if he acted or spoke hawkishly, he wouldn't get his second term, so he had to keep his mouth shut, let inflation run, confirm his second term, and then start trying to tackle it as aggressively as possible. And if that's the case, I mean, otherwise it's very hard to know why on earth the Fed is quite so far behind the curve. I mean, it's just beggars belief. And if that's the case, you know, then we're going to have, you know, history sort of showing us that all the previous attempts to get inflation back in its box that we know, at least from the 60s and 70s, ultimately failed, because inflation looks like it's behaving and coming down, and then it sort of re-accelerates like a plane coming into land that doesn't actually land, but then takes off again. And the only way Volcker was able to break that, and as you say, it wasn't in his first hiking term, it was his second hiking term. And the first one, sort of, you know, they sort of triggered a bit of a recession, and then that was getting too tough, and they sort of backed out of it. And the second one, he got the mandate to effectively hold the economy's head underwater for the extra required 24 months or whatever it was in order to finally finish off inflation. So I think it has two options. It either has to do a genuine Volcker, which means it has to hold rates at a high level, and that high level has to be above the headline rate of inflation. I mean, I think if you've still got negative Fed funds rate, you're not convincing anybody. So inflation has to come, let's say inflation comes down to 5%, you're going to have to get the Fed funds rate 2 or above 5%. Then you have to hold it there for long enough for it to work. And if the Fed blinks before that has been done, then the most likely scenario is that inflation is back and running again. The only thing that could stop that would be a proper continuation of the sort of collapse or control of broad money supply, but the Fed isn't in broad money supply. So my scenario therefore suggests that the most likely thing the market should be betting on is that inflation will be stickier and higher for longer than the straight line drop to 2% implies, which means bond yields need to be higher. And it's very rare to imagine an equity market that's going up when bond yields are, you know, going up.
Where does the energy crisis, the ongoing energy crisis, and deglobalization fit within your view of inflation? It's because it seems to me that if you come from a monetarist standpoint, you always are prone to see inflation as purely as a demand thing rather than a supply phenomenon or a mix of both. And I wonder, during the 70s, obviously, you had to have much higher interest rates in order to subdue inflation than what you'd have had in the 50s and the 60s, to the same extent that we've already had much higher interest rates over the last 12 months without constraining inflation. So, it seems to me that those structural factors are also behind Europe having double the inflation or almost double the inflation they've had in the US, which can only be a supply side cause of inflation rather than demand. What do you think about that, James?
Two things. The first one, if you look back to the 70s, it's worth bearing in mind that although interest rates were high, so was money supply growth. They weren't really suppressing money supply growth. If you want to really damp inflation down, you have to do what they did at the end of the Second World War in the late 40s, which is when they suppressed money supply growth and raised rates. And that's how but even then, inflation, it re-accelerated as soon as they took their foot off the brake. Was that entirely due to the Korean War, or was it due to, which also, of course, caused a re-acceleration of money supply growth, or would that have happened in peacetime too? That's one that's difficult to answer. If you're talking about the European situation with energy, I think you're absolutely right that a monetarist would say that it's all to do with money supply, is all to do with demand. So technically speaking, an energy price shock isn't really inflation, or that leads to higher prices. It's really a detrimental shift in the terms of trade, which is always about some specific part of the supply complex. And if you're going to spend more on your oil, then you have to decide to spend less on something else. What is that something else going to be? In inflation, the price of everything can go up. In the terms of trade shock, the bully in the room muscles out everything else. And then you have to decide who's going to pay the price. Is the heating for a pensioner's flat more or less politically important than running your champion aluminium exporters foundry? So that's when we start getting into which bits of this are going to turn political. And of course, political choices will almost always, by definition, otherwise they wouldn't have to be made, support the unproductive and therefore, frankly, more stagflationary option as opposed to the productive one.
Yeah, because although Volcker was ultimately successful in bringing down inflation, by 1981, we did have North Sea and Alaskan oil in full swing, and it's pretty difficult to see any supply growth in oil production or indeed reliable energy production anywhere in the world over the next 2 or 3 years, or even 5 years, I suspect.
Well, I mean that fits perfectly with the political. If you have anything which is a political choice, if the political choice is to let the most productive thing happen, then the right political choice is to do nothing and step back.
Yeah.
So the politicians are stepping forward and imposing their view, then by definition, that is a less productive choice that they're making. So if we choose to suppress EMP in the energy sector, then we're going to have an energy supply shortage, and that means we're going to pay more for our energy unless we can miraculously replace it all with renewables. But as you well know, therein lies the rub, as the bard would say. Never gonna, Václav Smil, who's one of the academic experts on these sorts of big picture stories, it explains that you've never had an energy transition that occurred in less than a generation in the history of mankind. And mankind's got a lot bigger recently than it ever has been before. So the concept of having a full transition to net zero, a massive generational energy transition, and affecting it in such a short period of time is almost impossible to even theoretically believe, and there certainly are no historical precedents for that. This is one of the reasons why Now I'm coming off the cuff here, so I don't want people to come back and try and quote me, but something like we get 86% of something of our global energy from fossil fuels 10 or 15 years ago, and now it's it's 83% or something. So that even though we've taken all the low-hanging fruit, you can't put wind farms in front of other wind farms because the one in front takes all the wind, etc., etc. So we've taken all the low-hanging fruit, and yet the impact we've had on the proportion of global energy that is not fossil fuel has been highly marginal. And coal use has actually gone up. So the fact that we could go to fully transition to net zero in the time frame allotted is just not going to happen. So now we ought to think about what will happen instead.
So if we think about the last 20 years, where up until recently, energy as a proportion of GDP had never been cheap, never been as cheap, and we also had globalization, so manufactured goods have never been as cheap as what they are now. What are the implications of that the end of those supply side forces which had kept inflation down on where monetary policy can go even in a downturn? I mean, you say that you think that we'll be going back to QE for possibly in 2 or 3 years time, but how could you go back to QE if there's a lot of structural inflation caused by energy poverty and trade wars?
Well, imagine the alternative. So I mean, I'm saying that they could go back to QE if they had successfully done the demand destruction and job destruction job of tightening monetary policy. But really, our problem, particularly with energy, is, as I said, it's more to do with the terms of trade shift. So if energy muscles its way into a bigger and bigger share of our money, then it's going to muscle other discretionary spending out. And the other problem with inflation is that inflation, according to the academics, inflation is a generalized rise in all prices. But of course, it's not. It's actually a race, to the front, where you get lots of people left behind and lots of people who pull ahead. In the UK in 1973, the miners were on strike. And the miners were on strike because the UK was being highly dependent. This was before North Sea oil. So there was no North Sea oil. All the oil came in from the Arab countries. And suddenly that was incredibly expensive in a way that they, at the time, assumed might never adjust down again. But luckily, the UK had coal. So the UK was going to be okay, except it wasn't going to be okay because the coal miners went, we've got the whole country exactly where we want it. So they basically forced the Edward Heath government, after the winter of discontent and blackouts and the rest of it, they destroyed the government. Just a small, very small part of the workforce took down the entire government, and the new Labour government that came in gave them a pay rise of 35%. And that's what, the bullies in the room can do. The bullies in the room basically, and of course, Maggie Thatcher learned from this that basically what you're going to do is never, ever trust a word that Arthur Scargill, the miners' leader, ever says again, and that she determined to destroy them no matter what the near-term negotiations. She said, there's no point. We can never trust these people, and we can't rely on them. We can't rely on them, then, we need North oil, not coal. So the problem with inflation is that inflation takes that lovely stable sort of a status quo situation, and it suddenly creates opportunities for the bullies and victims for the powerless. And I think once you unleash that, you've unleashed it, and I think we've already unleashed it, and I think it's too late, really.
Yeah. So essentially, we've got this incredibly hard landing where you have massive loss in living standards. Civilization crumbles. You've got a sort of Mad Max 4 scenario where you're Mad Max, I'm Tina Turner. Stock markets are down 99%, and then they step in and do QE.
Well, what they should do, which they won't do, but what they should do is step out. The solution to the problems that we've had in the UK since the great financial crisis has been more and more government, more and more QE. So government is now bigger as a proportion of GDP than it's ever been outside of wartime in the UK. The tax take is now 40%, and then of course they're loading another 10% or so of debt on top of that, which is going to mean that we have to pay more and more of our taxes having to go to pay interest. And so, and you know, any rational system would look at that and say, there is something here that seems to be the cause of all the problems. Productivity growth just hasn't happened since the financial crisis hit. It was going fine, and then it just stopped dead, and it hasn't recovered since. And this has all been the period during, you know, QE, more government intervention, more help from a guy who is clearly always incentivized to promote the unproductive over the productive. And so what you really need is less government. You need a radical change to what is going on, and you need the electorate to vote for any party that says, I'm not going to do more, I'm going to do less. But before we have that, the political incumbents are going to do the opposite of this. They're going to keep fiddling, even though all the evidence suggests it's wrong. They're going to keep fiddling more and more and more, and that means slamming the accelerator, slamming the brake, slamming the accelerator. So what is the accelerator? You know, if you hit the brake too hard and it finally works, they're going to jump straight on the accelerator and do QE. So I think what they'll do is they'll just keep flick-flacking us until, you know, hopefully the whole system comes to their senses. But I don't really expect them to come to their senses until we get to, you know, a crisis that is recognized by the population, the press, and the politicians alike as being a crisis. And just to end on a positive note, the thing that might do that, especially say the UK. So 2 years ago in the UK, the number of people who didn't pay any tax, working age people who didn't pay any tax, went to 52% of the population. Now that is the death of democracy, when you can vote largesse for yourself, when the taxpayers are the minority and everyone else just says, right, let's just rob them. But what's been forced to happen now is that the tax thresholds are not rising with inflation. Now, what that does is drag more and more people into paying higher band tax, but it also drags more and more people into being net taxpayers. And as that happens, of course, you're going to find that Westminster is more and more out of touch with the population. Westminster still thinks that the best way to buy votes is to show compassion, or at least what they think is compassion. Take money from those which they call broad-shouldered and give it to those which they call more deserving. But as the broad-shouldered, in inverted commas, become the majority, and it's their money that's being taken, they start to have a slightly different take on it. And so there is hope. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, but I don't think we're there yet.
So our friend, the Chancellor with the rucksack that dragged millions more into the top rate of tax, that was actually a shrewd political ruse rather than just utter socialism.
Not based on that Chancellor. That Chancellor is pretty obviously a Labour Chancellor, just masquerading with a big rosette. But no, it's, you know, sometimes the opposite of what they intend. You know, I don't think any of these people intended to destroy productivity growth. I don't think they intended to destroy the economy when they were doing things which they intended to help. The problem is that you know, you still see in the press. I read something just today in the press where someone was saying, you know, and unfortunately without government payouts to people, you know, that's going to have a negative effect on growth. So there's still this very strong perception that when government transfers money from a productive group to an unproductive group, that is somehow good for growth. So we've got to change that mindset. People have to understand that is just nonsense.
But that sort of lack of productivity was entirely behind the stop-go cycles of the 60s and 70s, wasn't it? That when you got the downturn, you immediately, you know, monetary policy, fiscal policy came in, but you never had the long deflationary up cycles that we've become used to since the 80s. And I think that for me is why, you know, we might get, you know, recessions and then monetary responses, but we also had those in the 70s as well, and it ended up being a terrible period for investors on the whole and a high inflationary decade.
Well, so one of the things we've got to do is clear the system. You know, the point about a recession is that we take all the capital and credit that we've applied to an unproductive idea that's turned out not to work, and we take that money out and we put it in a productive way. So you look at, I don't know, look at the recent clear out of staff at Twitter. You know, is that what Elon Musk is doing? Is he basically applying a recession to Twitter and saying, guys, you know, you've been living high off the hog. You know, there was nothing to stop any boss hiring as many millions as he wanted on the company ticket, and that all has to end. Otherwise, we're never going to make any money. So therefore, I'm going to impose a mini version of what a recession should do to an economy onto my new acquisition. So are we going to have, do we have the wherewithal, the political force of will to employ a proper recession on the economy, one that takes all those people who've got non-jobs in all sorts of highly regulated areas, you know, health and safety experts or compliance officers or anyone who just doesn't basically bring in anything productive at all? And do we have to will we have enough of a recession to get them all fired and send them all off to get a decent job, you know, with sales commissions, doing something more useful? Personally, I don't think we will. Not first time round. That's why I say we're going to resort on to QE. But we need that in the end, obviously.
Yeah, James, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time. Where can people find you if they want to explore and follow your views outside of this podcast?
Well, we have a website, Macrostrategy Partnership LLP. The only problem is that we're not FCA regulated to talk to retail. So unless
professional investors only, then.
I'm afraid professional investors only. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for listening as well. Remember, we're not gnomes, we're not from Zurich, but we are the gnomes of Zurich.